If money solves problems, why can't we just print more of it? Why can't governments make everyone rich? Because printing money doesn't create wealth, it destroys it. Every bill you print without producing something of value makes the dollars in your pocket worth less. Today, I'll show you why printing money feels like a shortcut, but ends like a collapse, and how understanding this one truth separates the financially free from the financially fooled. This isn't just economics, this is survival in the real world of money. Chapter 1. The Big Illusion. More money, more wealth. Everyone wants more money. Everyone's chasing it, but here is the truth no one wants to say out loud. More money doesn't mean more wealth. Because you can print currency, but you can't print value. Governments print money every day. They call it stimulus. They call it quantitative easing. But what they're really doing is watering down the system. It's like adding water to wine. The glass looks full, but the strength is gone. When new money floods the economy, prices rise, savings shrink, and purchasing power fades. That's not wealth creation. That's wealth illusion. Wealth isn't measured by how much money you hold, it's measured by what that money can do, by how much freedom it buys, by how long it lasts. Printing money inflates numbers, not prosperity. You don't become richer just because there are more dollars in circulation. You become poorer because the dollars you already have lose value. Inflation is theft. Quiet, invisible, and devastating. It steals from savers. It punishes discipline. It rewards debt and speculation, and it's built into the system. That's why you can't just chase more money. You have to chase value. Here's the principle. Real wealth is not printed. It's produced. It's created through productivity, by building, solving, and producing what others need. When a farmer grows food, when an engineer builds a bridge, when a developer codes software, that's value. That's how wealth is born. Because wealth isn't earned, it's built. And it's built by producing more than you consume. You can't consume your way to prosperity. You can't spend your way to wealth. You must create your way there. This is why some nations rise while others stall, and why some people build generational wealth while others stay trapped. The rich don't chase money. They build systems that create value. They own productivity, not paper. You can print currency, but you can't print value. And the moment you forget that, you lose control of your financial destiny. Let's make it real. If tomorrow every person received a free $10,000 check, what would happen? No new homes are built. No new food is grown. No new energy is created. Just more paper chasing the same limited resources. And when more money chases the same goods, prices explode, groceries jump, rent soars, gas climbs, the illusion shatters, the poor get squeezed, the middle class gets frustrated, the wealthy adapt because the wealthy don't store cash, they store assets, they understand the game. The rich don't work harder for paper, they own the systems that print it, they own businesses, they own real estate, they own intellectual property. Assets rise as money loses value, because when inflation hits, ownership wins. Cash flow is freedom, and the system won't save you, ownership will. So how do you escape the illusion? How do you stop chasing paper and start building wealth that lasts? It starts with a mental reset. Stop asking, how can I make more money? Start asking, how can I create more value? Money flows toward value, always. When you become more productive, more skilled, and more valuable to the market, you'll never fear inflation again. You'll always stay ahead of it. That's why entrepreneurs thrive in uncertainty. They don't wait for the system to change. They create change and profit from it. They turn problems into products, needs into income, ideas into assets. That's the builder's mindset, the investor's mindset, the wealth mindset. Because the truth is, our entire economy runs on debt, not productivity. People borrow to consume, governments borrow to survive, corporations borrow to manipulate stock prices. It's a world built on IOUs. But you don't have to play that game. When everyone else holds debt, you hold equity. When everyone else saves cash, you build assets. When everyone else reacts, you move with strategy. You can't print your way to wealth, but you can produce your way there. So let's talk action. Here's what every wealth builder must do right now. Stop hoarding cash. Inflation destroys idle money. Keep an emergency fund, but move the rest into growth. Invest in productive assets. Own things that generate income, businesses, real estate, digital assets, or intellectual property. Increase your productivity. Master high-value skills. Automate what you can. Focus your time on actions that multiply value, not maintain it. Measure true wealth. Don't track your salary. Track your ownership. Count your assets, your cash flow, and your freedom. Detach your identity from money. Money is just a tool. It's not your worth. Your value comes from what you create and control. Because when the next crisis hits, and it always does, those chasing money will lose, but those who've built value will thrive. You can print currency, but you can't print value. Wealth builders see beyond the illusion. They don't collect paper. They collect power. Every dollar you hold is just a claim on someone else's productivity. Every asset you own is a claim on future income. Every skill you build increases your ability to create real value. No matter what happens in the economy, that's how you win the game, not by working harder for money, but by owning the means to make more of it. You don't need more money, you need better moves. And it all begins with this realization: the world runs on illusions, but value always wins. You can inflate numbers, manipulate systems, and flood markets, but you can't fake productivity. You can't counterfeit skill. You can't cheat ownership. Real wealth is built, brick by brick, skill by skill, asset by asset. And once you see through the illusion, once you understand that more money doesn't equal more wealth, you'll never think about finance the same way again. You've learned how to see through the illusion, how printing money creates numbers, not value. Now it's time to discover how true wealth is built. Chapter 2. The Hidden Tax. How inflation steals in silence. There's a tax you pay every single day, and you don't even see it. It's not on your paycheck. It's not on your property bill. It's hidden in the price of your groceries, your rent, your energy, your life. That tax is inflation. Inflation is the invisible thief that steals while you sleep. It punishes savers, it rewards debtors, and it's one of the most powerful wealth transfer mechanisms in the world. Because here's the truth: when governments print, your purchasing power disappears, not with a vote, not with a warning, but with a whisper. This isn't an accident, it's a feature of the system. The economy runs on debt, and inflation keeps that debt alive. But it does it at your expense. You work harder, you earn more, and yet somehow you can buy less. That's not bad luck, that's policy. Let's make it clear. Inflation is not rising prices. That's the symptom. Inflation is the devaluation of money. It's what happens when more currency chases the same amount of goods. It's not that the loaf of bread suddenly got more valuable, it's that your dollar got weaker. Governments love inflation because it's the easiest way to erase debt. If the currency is worth less tomorrow, they can repay today's massive obligations with cheaper dollars. Debt disappears quietly, savings evaporate silently, and you, the saver, lose purchasing power without realizing it. It's taxation without legislation. You never approved it, but you pay it every time you swipe your card. Look back to the 1970s. The United States printed heavily to fund war, welfare, and political promises. The result? Double-digit inflation, gas prices through the roof, interest rates hitting 20%. Paychecks rose, but power didn't. You earned more dollars, but those dollars bought less. People thought they were getting richer because the numbers on their checks were bigger, but it was an illusion. They were running faster just to stay in place. That's the silent cruelty of inflation. It hides behind bigger numbers. It tricks people into thinking progress is happening, when in reality, their quality of life is slipping away. You can print money, but you can't print value. Let's talk about what inflation really does. It punishes the disciplined, the people who save, plan, and delay gratification. Every year, their savings buy less. Their future becomes more expensive. It rewards the indebted, the people who borrow to buy real assets, homes, businesses, investments. As inflation rises, their debt becomes easier to pay off because they're using weaker dollars. It's upside-down economics, a system that punishes prudence and rewards leverage. That's why the rich play by different rules. They don't store money, they store value. While the average person saves in cash, the wealthy save in assets. Assets that rise as money falls, because cash flow is freedom, and when inflation hits, it's the cash-flowing assets that survive, not the idle savings. Here's the harsh truth. If you're saving cash in a traditional savings account, you're not playing defense, you're losing by default. Your safe money is quietly melting away month after month as inflation eats your purchasing power. If inflation runs at 6% and your bank pays you 2%, you're losing 4% a year in real terms. That's not security. That's slow decay. And the longer you wait, the worse it gets. So what do the wealthy do differently? They convert their money into things inflation can destroy, things that hold or grow in value even as currencies crumble. Real estate, businesses, commodities, stocks, intellectual property. Because while governments can print paper, they can't print property, innovation, or ownership. That's how the wealthy stay ahead. They understand the hidden tax. They build protection into their portfolios, and they never trust the system to save them. The system won't save you. Ownership will. Let's break down the real strategy, how to outsmart inflation and protect your future. 1. Stop storing money. Start storing value. Keep a small emergency fund, but don't let fear keep you sitting on idle cash. Convert surplus income into appreciating or income-producing assets. 2. Own what inflates. Own the things that rise when money falls. Real estate, equities, productive businesses, and scarce resources. 3. Leverage intelligently. Debt can be your ally if it's used to buy assets that outpace inflation. Borrow at fixed rates, invest in things that produce, and let inflation work for you instead of against you. 4. Build cash flow, because cash flow is your lifeline. When your income comes from assets instead of wages, inflation becomes less of a threat. Your earnings adjust with prices. 5. Invest in yourself. Skills are the ultimate inflation hedge. You can't devalue expertise, leadership, or problem-solving. When money loses power, your value should increase. These moves transform you from victim to strategist, from spender to investor, from someone the system exploits to someone who masters it. Because inflation doesn't have to be your enemy. It can be your leverage if you understand how the game works. Let's step back. What's the real message here? Inflation is not just economics, it's psychology. It teaches people to chase short-term gains because their dollars lose value over time. It creates fear, uncertainty, and urgency, all of which make people easy to control. But when you understand it, when you see it, you take back power. You stop chasing bigger paychecks and start chasing bigger ownership. You stop saving in paper and start saving in assets. You stop reacting and start building. Because wealth isn't earned, it's built. You don't need more money, you need better moves. And one of the best moves you can make is to step out of the system's illusion and build real inflation-proof wealth that compounds over time. Remember, inflation doesn't just raise prices, it silently transfers wealth from those who earn it to those who own it. You can print currency, you can manipulate numbers, but you can't counterfeit value. That's why ownership, not wages, is the only path to lasting wealth. You've learned how inflation steals in silence, how it punishes savers, rewards debtors, and reshapes the economy without a single vote. Now it's time to flip the script and use the system to your advantage. Chapter 3. When printing becomes panic. There's a moment in every collapsing empire when the printing presses start to roar. It sounds like policy. It feels like stimulus. But it's really panic, because governments print when they can't grow. When productivity stalls, when tax revenue dries up, when debt piles higher than they can repay, they reach for the easiest button in the room, the print button. They tell the public it's a rescue plan. They call it quantitative easing. They wrap it in words like liquidity, stability, and stimulus. But make no mistake, it's not strategy, it's survival. Printing is the economic equivalent of borrowing from the future to pretend the present is fine. And history has shown, again and again, where that road leads. Let's go back to one of the most infamous examples in financial history, the Weimar Republic in the 1920s. Germany was buried under war debt after World War I. The economy was broken, production was crippled, and the government, desperate to pay its bills, decided to print its way out. At first it seemed to work. The economy appeared alive again. Paper flooded the streets. People felt richer, for a moment. But here's the rule you can never forget. You can print currency, but you can't print value. Within months, that illusion collapsed. The value of the German mark began to fall, slowly at first, then uncontrollably. Prices doubled by the week, then by the day, then by the hour. Workers were paid twice a day just so they could buy food before prices changed again. People carried wheelbarrows full of cash to buy bread. Children played with stacks of banknotes because they were worth less than the paper they were printed on. And then came the real tragedy. When money lost trust, society lost order. Because when trust dies, money dies. Once a currency collapses, people stop believing in the system. They turn to bartering, gold or foreign currencies, anything that holds value. And when that trust is gone, it's nearly impossible to restore. Weimar Germany printed itself into chaos, and history never forgot. Now you might say, that was 100 years ago. It can't happen now. But look around. The same pattern repeats every century, just with new language and better marketing. Governments always promise they can manage it. They say, this time is different. But it never is. When leaders print more money instead of producing more value, they're not solving problems, they're amplifying them. Printing money doesn't fix weak economies. It hides them. It's like covering a wound with makeup instead of medicine. It looks fine for a while, until it gets infected. And once the infection spreads, once the public senses fear, once trust begins to die, the system unravels. When trust dies, money dies. That's not just history, that's human behavior. Money itself is built entirely on trust. It has no intrinsic value. It's just paper or pixels, backed by faith in the system that issues it. When that faith breaks, the entire illusion collapses. That's what happened in Weimar. That's what happened in Zimbabwe. That's what happened in Venezuela. Each time, governments turned to the same desperate trick. Print, promise, repeat. Each time the outcome was the same, collapse. Because printing is not power, production is. When a country stops producing, it stops creating real wealth. And once it replaces productivity with printing, its money loses meaning. You can't build strength on paper. You can't inflate prosperity. You can't counterfeit trust. Now let's connect this to you. The individual wealth builder. You live in a world where the same game is still being played, just more quietly. Central banks print trillions, currencies weaken, and yet most people cheer when they see stimulus checks and free money. But nothing is free. Every printed dollar steals from every earned one. That's the real hidden cost. Your purchasing power, your savings, your time. You work harder for less. You run faster just to stand still. That's what happens when printing replaces growth. So what can you do? You do what wealth builders have always done. You stop depending on the system. You start building your own. Here's your strategy. 1. Build trust in value, not paper. Invest in assets that people will always trust. Land, businesses, commodities, intellectual property. Because when money loses trust, value remains. 2. Own productive assets. Buy things that make things. Businesses, real estate, or investments tied to real productivity. Production outlives inflation. 3. Diversify across systems. Never let your entire net worth depend on one currency or one country. Hold value in multiple forms: dollars, gold, equities, digital assets. So if one fails, the others stand. 4. Watch government behavior, not government words. When printing increases, prepare for devaluation. When debt rises faster than growth, move your wealth into assets that can't be printed. 5. Build self-sufficiency. Wealth isn't just financial, it's structural. The more you control your income streams, your skills, and your production, the less vulnerable you are to the panic of others. Because when the system panics, producers thrive. You have to think like a creator, not a consumer. You have to build, not beg. Because the system won't save you, ownership will. Printing money may look like prosperity, but it's just borrowed time. Every empire that printed its way out of crisis eventually collapsed under its own lies. The smart ones, the builders, the investors, the producers, saw it coming. They positioned themselves in value, not volume, in ownership, not illusion. And when the collapse came, they didn't just survive, they rebuilt. You can do the same. You don't need more money, you need better moves. Moves built on value, production, and ownership. Because when printing becomes panic, trust becomes the most valuable asset you can hold. And once that trust breaks, history resets, and those who built real wealth write the next chapter. So remember this line: when trust dies, money dies. The printing press has always been the last refuge of weak leadership. But you're not weak. You're not waiting, you're building. Because wealth isn't earned, it's built, and the next financial panic won't destroy you, it will define you. You've learned why governments print when they can grow, and how trust is the true foundation of money. Now it's time to learn how the wealthy protect that trust by turning paper into power. Chapter 4. Hyperinflation. The collapse of confidence. There's a point where money stops being money, where paper stops holding power, where numbers keep rising but everything else falls apart. That moment is called hyperinflation, and when it hits, it doesn't just destroy an economy. It destroys trust, because when people stop believing in their money, it's game over. We've seen this story before, not in ancient history, but in our lifetime. Zimbabwe, 2008. Venezuela, 2016. Two nations, oceans apart, but both victims of the same disease, the collapse of confidence. Let's start with Zimbabwe. Once known as Africa's breadbasket, Zimbabwe was a thriving agricultural hub. But decades of corruption, overspending, and debt cracked its foundation. And when the bills came due, the government did what weak governments always do. It printed more money. At first, it seemed harmless. More notes in circulation, more spending, more movement. But then prices started rising, and they didn't stop. By 2008, inflation had hit 231 million%. A single loaf of bread cost trillions of Zimbabwean dollars. People carried stacks of cash in backpacks just to buy lunch. Banks ran out of zeros to print on the bills. They had to issue a $100 trillion note, and it still couldn't buy a bus ticket. Money became meaningless. Savings evaporated. The middle class, gone overnight. Shops stopped pricing goods, they priced time. If you didn't buy within the hour, the price would double. That's what happens when money loses trust, because you can print currency, but you can't print confidence. Now let's move to Venezuela, 2016. The country sat on the world's largest oil reserves, yet shelves were empty and the lights were going out. Why? Because the government, drowning in debt and declining oil revenue, began printing bolivars to fill the gap. And just like Zimbabwe, the illusion didn't last. Inflation exploded. Prices doubled every few weeks. By 2019, inflation hit an almost incomprehensible 10 million%. Citizens stopped checking price tags. They checked hours. What cost 1 bolivar in the morning could cost 3 by nightfall. And that's when confidence died. The currency that once paid wages became worthless. Workers refused salaries in bolivars. Doctors, teachers, and police officers stopped showing up because paper no longer bought food. People turned to US dollars, to gold, even to crypto. Anything with a pulse of trust left in it. That's the real face of hyperinflation. Not numbers on screens, not charts or headlines, but empty shelves. Dark homes, hungry families. It's not a financial event, it's a human one. So let's understand what really causes hyperinflation. Not in theory, but in truth. Hyperinflation isn't about prices going up, it's about trust breaking down. When citizens lose faith in the value of their money, that money collapses instantly. A government can print trillions of notes, but if no one believes those notes will hold value tomorrow, they become worthless today. Money only works when people trust that others will accept it. Once that shared belief dies, the entire system follows. That's why hyperinflation is the collapse of confidence. It's not the numbers that matter, it's the psychology. Here's what you must understand as a wealth builder. Hyperinflation is extreme, but it's the final stage of a process that always starts the same way, with excess printing and false prosperity. It begins when governments spend more than they earn, when they trade productivity for politics, when they use printed money to buy votes, bail out corporations, or fund endless promises. It feels good at first. People feel richer. Markets go up. The illusion spreads. But behind the scenes, trust starts to decay, because every printed dollar steals from every saved dollar. And eventually, the people who understand value stop trusting the currency altogether. That's when the spiral begins. And once it starts, it's nearly impossible to stop. So what can you learn from Zimbabwe and Venezuela? How do you protect yourself from a system built on faith that can fade overnight? Here's the lesson. You can't control the system, but you can control your exposure to it. Here's how. 1. Hold assets, not illusions. Never rely solely on paper. Own what can't be printed. Real estate, businesses, commodities, skills. When trust collapses, value remains. 2. Diversify across currencies. Never tie your entire net worth to one nation's money. Hold multiple currencies, or better yet, hold assets denominated in different systems. 3. Build cash flow, because cash flow is freedom. When your money works for you, through rent, dividends, royalties, or business income, you're not dependent on the next government decision. 4. Invest in productivity. Productivity creates value, even when money loses it. If you can produce food, energy, skills, technology, you'll always be in demand, no matter what the currency is doing. 5. Stay alert to behavior, not promises. When governments start printing to cover their debts, that's your warning. History never repeats exactly, but it rhymes perfectly. Hyperinflation is not just about numbers, it's about belief. When belief breaks, no amount of paper can put it back together. And that's the danger we face in every economy built on debt and denial. The illusion works until it doesn't, because when trust dies, money dies. You can see it in every hyperinflation crisis. The middle class collapses, savings vanish, and ownership, real ownership, becomes the only defense. Those who hold assets endure, those who hold paper fall. That's why the wealthy don't panic in these moments. They prepare for them. They understand that wealth isn't the paper in your hand, it's the value you control. The system won't save you, ownership will. Here's the truth every builder must remember. Governments can fake growth with printing, they can fake stability with policy, but they can't fake confidence. Once people lose faith in the system's money, the reset begins. That's why your mission is simple. Build wealth that survives the reset, wealth that exists outside the illusion. Wealth rooted in assets, skills, and value creation, because you don't need more money, you need better moves. So take the lesson from Zimbabwe and Venezuela and never forget it. Hyperinflation isn't just about currency collapse. It's about what happens when an entire nation realizes all at once that the paper in their hands no longer means anything. It's not a financial crisis, it's a confidence crisis. And once that trust dies, everything else goes with it. Because when a society stops believing in its money, it stops believing in itself. That's the real cost of printing without purpose. That's the real danger of chasing numbers instead of value. Wealth isn't earned, it's built. And it's built on trust, the one resource that no government can print. You've learned what happens when printing turns into panic, when trust collapses and money follows. Now it's time to learn how to position yourself on the winning side of that collapse. In Chapter 5, the Federal Reserve, the printer and the puppet master. Every empire has its power center. Rome had its Senate, Britain had its crown, and America has the Federal Reserve. The Fed isn't just a bank, it's the most powerful financial institution on earth. And yet most people barely understand what it does or how it shapes every dollar in their life. Because the truth is simple, but brutal. The Federal Reserve doesn't just print money, it controls the system that decides who wins and who loses. Let's strip the jargon away. The Fed sets interest rates, it controls credit, it manages the money supply, and it decides, sometimes in silence, how tight or loose the flow of dollars will be. When the Fed raises rates, money gets expensive. When it lowers them, money gets cheap. Cheap money fuels booms. Expensive money creates busts. And through those cycles, the Fed doesn't just influence markets, it moves them. That's why it's called the puppet master. Stocks, bonds, housing, jobs, every thread is pulled by the same invisible hand. Now, let's talk about the phrase that sounds sophisticated but hides a simple truth: quantitative easing. It's a term wrapped in technical language, designed to sound harmless, even responsible. But here's what it really means: money creation in a suit and tie. During every crisis, the Fed steps in and buys assets, government bonds, mortgage-backed securities, sometimes even corporate debt. How does it pay for those assets? It doesn't have the money. It creates it with a few keystrokes. That's not a conspiracy, that's policy. When the Fed prints digitally, it expands the balance sheet of the central bank. That new money flows into the financial system, bidding up the price of assets, stocks, bonds, real estate. It doesn't go to the average worker. It goes to the system, the same system that already owns the assets. And that's how inequality quietly explodes. Because when the Fed prints, the wealthy get richer, not because they work harder, but because they own the assets that rise in price. Meanwhile, savers get punished. Their dollars lose value. Their cash earns nothing. Their purchasing power erodes, while asset owners watch their portfolios soar. That's the hidden redistribution of wealth, engineered not by Congress, but by monetary policy. The Fed says it prints to support stability. But stability for who? For the banks that depend on cheap credit, for the markets that panic without liquidity, for the system that can't survive a slowdown. That's the truth most people never hear. The Fed doesn't print to get rich, it prints to survive the system it built, because this system runs on debt. Debt is the oxygen, and the Fed's job is to make sure no one stops breathing. When markets crash, it prints. When banks fail, it prints. When the economy slows, it prints. Not because it wants to, but because it has no choice. The Fed is both the firefighter and the arsonist. It rescues the system from the very fires it helped ignite. Let's go deeper. When the Fed manipulates interest rates, it's not just changing numbers, it's reshaping behavior. Low rates encourage borrowing. Borrowing fuels spending. Spending drives growth. But too much borrowing leads to bubbles, and bubbles always burst. When they do, the Fed steps in again, cutting rates, printing money, and restarting the cycle. It's an endless feedback loop. Stimulus, boom, bust, repeat. And at every turn, those closest to the money, the banks, the corporations, the asset managers, benefit first. By the time that new money reaches the real economy, prices have already gone up. The rich get richer. The poor pay more. That's the silent power of monetary policy. It's not voted on. It's not debated in public. But it shapes your financial reality every single day. So what can you, the individual, do about it? You can't fight the Fed, but you can front-run its impact. Here's how the wealthy play the game. 1. They own assets, not cash. When the Fed prints, assets inflate. When the Fed tightens, assets correct. But real ownership always rebounds stronger than paper savings. That's why ownership is protection. 2. They study liquidity cycles. When money is cheap and flowing, risk assets boom. When liquidity tightens, capital dries up. Smart investors read those signals like weather reports. 3. They use debt strategically. The Fed manipulates rates. You can use that to your advantage. Borrow when money is cheap. Lock in fixed rates. Invest in productive assets because cash flow is freedom. 4. They hedge against currency decay. Gold, real estate, productive businesses, these hold value even when the dollar weakens. Because real value doesn't come from policy, it comes from productivity. 5. They understand incentives. The Fed will always act to preserve the system, not the citizen. So stop waiting for rescue. Start building resilience, because the system won't save you. Ownership will. Let's pull back for a moment. Every crisis of the past century, from the Great Depression to 2008 to 2020, has ended the same way, with the Fed printing money to stabilize the illusion. And each time, the stakes get higher. The money supply gets bigger, the debt gets deeper, and the dependency grows stronger. The world doesn't run on productivity anymore. It runs on liquidity, and the Fed is the ultimate source of it. But here's the warning. A system that depends on infinite printing is a system that's already dying. You can't print trust, you can't print value, and eventually the illusion will break. So what's your move? Understand the game. Play offense, not defense. Own what the Fed can't devalue. Build streams of income that don't depend on their policy decisions, because wealth isn't earned, it's built. And it's built by mastering the system, not obeying it. When the Fed prints, inflation follows. When the Fed tightens, opportunity returns. Cycles are predictable if you know what to look for. So don't fear the puppet master. Learn the strings, and then use them to your advantage. The Federal Reserve isn't your enemy. It's your signal. It tells you where the money's flowing and when the tide's about to turn. The people who get rich aren't the ones who panic. They're the ones who position. They know. The Fed doesn't print to get rich. It prints to survive the system it built. And if you understand that, you can survive. And thrive, too. Because the game isn't about fighting the system. It's about building wealth that outlasts it. You don't need more money. You need better moves. You've now seen how the puppet master pulls the strings, and why the system must keep printing to stay alive. But what happens when the world stops trusting that system altogether? That's when everything resets. Chapter 5. The Federal Reserve, the printer and the puppet master. Every empire has its power center. Rome had its Senate, Britain had its crown, and America has the Federal Reserve. The Fed isn't just a bank, it's the most powerful financial institution on earth, and yet most people barely understand what it does or how it shapes every dollar in their life. Because the truth is simple but brutal. The Federal Reserve doesn't just print money. It controls the system that decides who wins and who loses. Let's strip the jargon away. The Fed sets interest rates. It controls credit. It manages the money supply. And it decides, sometimes in silence, how tight or loose the flow of dollars will be. When the Fed raises rates, money gets expensive. When it lowers them, money gets cheap. Cheap money fuels booms. Expensive money creates busts. And through those cycles, the Fed doesn't just influence markets, it moves them. That's why it's called the puppet master. Stocks, bonds, housing, jobs, every thread is pulled by the same invisible hand. Now let's talk about the phrase that sounds sophisticated but hides a simple truth: quantitative easing. It's a term wrapped in technical language, designed to sound harmless, even responsible. But here's what it really means: money creation in a suit and tie. During every crisis, the Fed steps in and buys assets, government bonds, mortgage-backed securities, sometimes even corporate debt. How does it pay for those assets? It doesn't have the money, it creates it, with a few keystrokes. That's not a conspiracy, that's policy. When the Fed prints digitally, it expands the balance sheet of the central bank. That new money flows into the financial system, bidding up the price of assets. Stocks, bonds, real estate. It doesn't go to the average worker. It goes to the system, the same system that already owns the assets. And that's how inequality quietly explodes. Because when the Fed prints, the wealthy get richer. Not because they work harder, but because they own the assets that rise in price. Meanwhile, savers get punished. Their dollars lose value. Their cash earns nothing. Their purchasing power erodes, while asset owners watch their portfolios soar. That's the hidden redistribution of wealth, engineered not by Congress, but by monetary policy. The Fed says it prints to support stability. But stability for who? For the banks that depend on cheap credit, for the markets that panic without liquidity, for the system that can't survive a slowdown. That's the truth most people never hear. The Fed doesn't print to get rich. It prints to survive the system it built. Because this system runs on debt. Debt is the oxygen, and the Fed's job is to make sure no one stops breathing. When markets crash, it prints. When banks fail, it prints. When the economy slows, it prints. Not because it wants to, but because it has no choice. The Fed is both the firefighter and the arsonist. It rescues the system from the very fires it helped ignite. Let's go deeper. When the Fed manipulates interest rates, it's not just changing numbers, it's reshaping behavior. Low rates encourage borrowing. Borrowing fuels spending. Spending drives growth, but too much borrowing leads to bubbles, and bubbles always burst. When they do, the Fed steps in again, cutting rates, printing money, and restarting the cycle. It's an endless feedback loop. Stimulus, boom, bust, repeat. And at every turn, those closest to the money, the banks, the corporations, the asset managers, benefit first. By the time that new money reaches the real economy, prices have already gone up. The rich get richer, the poor pay more. That's the silent power of monetary policy. It's not voted on, it's not debated in public, but it shapes your financial reality every single day. So what can you, the individual, do about it? You can't fight the Fed, but you can front-run its impact. Here's how the wealthy play the game. 1. They own assets, not cash. When the Fed prints, assets inflate. When the Fed tightens, assets correct. But real ownership always rebounds stronger than paper savings. That's why ownership is protection. 2. They study liquidity cycles. When money is cheap and flowing, risk assets boom. When liquidity tightens, capital dries up. Smart investors read those signals like weather reports. 3. They use debt strategically. The Fed manipulates rates. You can use that to your advantage. Borrow when money is cheap. Lock in fixed rates. Invest in productive assets, because cash flow is freedom. 4. They hedge against currency decay. Gold, real estate, productive businesses. These hold value even when the dollar weakens, Because real value doesn't come from policy. It comes from productivity. 5. They understand incentives. The Fed will always act to preserve the system, not the citizen, so stop waiting for rescue, start building resilience. Because the system won't save you, ownership will. Let's pull back for a moment. Every crisis of the past century, from the Great Depression to 2008 to 2020, has ended the same way, with the Fed printing money to stabilize the illusion. And each time, the stakes get higher, the money supply gets bigger, the debt gets deeper, and the dependency grows stronger. The world doesn't run on productivity anymore. It runs on liquidity, and the Fed is the ultimate source of it. But here's the warning. A system that depends on infinite printing is a system that's already dying. You can't print trust, you can't print value, and eventually the illusion will break. So what's your move? Understand the game. Play offense, not defense. Own what the Fed can't devalue. Build streams of income that don't depend on their policy decisions. Because wealth isn't earned, it's built. And it's built by mastering the system, not obeying it. When the Fed prints, inflation follows. When the Fed tightens, opportunity returns. Cycles are predictable, if you know what to look for. So don't fear the puppet master. Learn the strings, and then use them to your advantage. The Federal Reserve isn't your enemy, it's your signal. It tells you where the money's flowing and when the tide's about to turn. The people who get rich aren't the ones who panic. They're the ones who position. They know. The Fed doesn't print to get rich. It prints to survive the system it built. And if you understand that, you can survive. And thrive, too. Because the game isn't about fighting the system. It's about building wealth that outlasts it. You don't need more money. You need better moves. You've now seen how the puppet master pulls the strings and why the system must keep printing to stay alive. But what happens when the world stops trusting that system altogether? That's when everything resets. Chapter 5. The Federal Reserve. The printer and the puppet master. Every empire has its power center. Rome had its Senate, Britain had its crown, and America has the Federal Reserve. The Fed isn't just a bank. It's the most powerful financial institution on Earth. And yet, most people barely understand what it does or how it shapes every dollar in their life. Because the truth is simple but brutal. The Federal Reserve doesn't just print money, it controls the system that decides who wins and who loses. Let's strip the jargon away. The Fed sets interest rates, it controls credit, it manages the money supply, and it decides, sometimes in silence, how tight or loose the flow of dollars will be. When the Fed raises rates, money gets expensive. When it lowers them, money gets cheap. Cheap money fuels booms, expensive money creates busts. And through those cycles, the Fed doesn't just influence markets, it moves them. That's why it's called the puppet master. Stocks, bonds, housing, jobs, every thread is pulled by the same invisible hand. Now, let's talk about the phrase that sounds sophisticated but hides a simple truth. Quantitative easing. It's a term wrapped in technical language, designed to sound harmless, even responsible. But here's what it really means. Money creation in a suit and tie. During every crisis, the Fed steps in and buys assets. Government bonds, mortgage-backed securities, sometimes even corporate debt. How does it pay for those assets? It doesn't have the money, it creates it, with a few keystrokes. That's not a conspiracy, that's policy. When the Fed prints digitally, it expands the balance sheet of the central bank. That new money flows into the financial system, bidding up the price of assets, stocks, bonds, real estate. It doesn't go to the average worker. It goes to the system, the same system that already owns the assets. And that's how inequality quietly explodes. Because when the Fed prints, the wealthy get richer, not because they work harder, but because they own the assets that rise in price. Meanwhile, savers get punished. Their dollars lose value, their cash earns nothing, their purchasing power erodes, while asset owners watch their portfolios soar. That's the hidden redistribution of wealth, engineered not by Congress, but by monetary policy. The Fed says it prints to support stability. But stability for who? For the banks that depend on cheap credit, for the markets that panic without liquidity, for the system that can't survive a slowdown. That's the truth most people never hear. The Fed doesn't print to get rich. It prints to survive the system it built. Because this system runs on debt. Debt is the oxygen, and the Fed's job is to make sure no one stops breathing. When markets crash, it prints. When banks fail, it prints. When the economy slows, it prints. Not because it wants to, but because it has no choice. The Fed is both the firefighter and the arsonist. It rescues the system from the very fires it helped ignite. Let's go deeper. When the Fed manipulates interest rates, it's not just changing numbers, it's reshaping behavior. Low rates encourage borrowing. Borrowing fuels spending. Spending drives growth. But too much borrowing leads to bubbles, and bubbles always burst. When they do, the Fed steps in again, cutting rates, printing money, and restarting the cycle. It's an endless feedback loop. Stimulus, boom, bust, repeat. And at every turn, those closest to the money, the banks, the corporations, the asset managers, benefit first. By the time that new money reaches the real economy, prices have already gone up. The rich get richer, the poor pay more. That's the silent power of monetary policy. It's not voted on, it's not debated in public, but it shapes your financial reality every single day. So what can you, the individual, do about it? You can't fight the Fed, but you can front-run its impact. Here's how the wealthy play the game. 1. They own assets, not cash. When the Fed prints, assets inflate. When the Fed tightens, assets correct, but real ownership always rebounds stronger than paper savings. That's why ownership is protection. 2. They study liquidity cycles. When money is cheap and flowing, risk assets boom. When liquidity tightens, capital dries up. Smart investors read those signals like weather reports. 3. They use debt strategically. The Fed manipulates rates. You can use that to your advantage. Borrow when money is cheap, lock in fixed rates. Invest in productive assets, because cash flow is freedom. 4. They hedge against currency decay. Gold, real estate, productive businesses, these hold value even when the dollar weakens. Because real value doesn't come from policy. It comes from productivity. 5. They understand incentives. The Fed will always act to preserve the system, not the citizen. So stop waiting for rescue. Start building resilience. Because the system won't save you, ownership will. Let's pull back for a moment. Every crisis of the past century, from the Great Depression to 2008 to 2020, has ended the same way, with the Fed printing money to stabilize the illusion. And each time the stakes get higher, the money supply gets bigger, the debt gets deeper, and the dependency grows stronger. The world doesn't run on productivity anymore, it runs on liquidity, and the Fed is the ultimate source of it. But here's the warning, a system that depends on infinite printing is a system that's already dying. You can't print trust, you can't print value, and eventually the illusion will break. So what's your move? Understand the game, play offense, not defense. Own what the Fed can't devalue. Build streams of income that don't depend on their policy decisions. Because wealth isn't earned, it's built. And it's built by mastering the system, not obeying it. When the Fed prints, inflation follows. When the Fed tightens, opportunity returns. Cycles are predictable if you know what to look for, so don't fear the puppet master. Learn the strings, and then use them to your advantage. The Federal Reserve isn't your enemy, it's your signal. It tells you where the money's flowing and when the tide's about to turn. The people who get rich aren't the ones who panic. They're the ones who position. They know the Fed doesn't print to get rich, it prints to survive the system it built. And if you understand that, you can survive and thrive too, because the game isn't about fighting the system. It's about building wealth that outlasts it. You don't need more money. You need better moves. You've now seen how the puppet master pulls the strings and why the system must keep printing to stay alive. But what happens when the world stops trusting that system altogether? That's when everything resets. Chapter 6. Debt, not dollars, runs the modern economy. Most people believe the economy runs on money. They're wrong. It runs on debt. Every dollar in your pocket, every swipe of your card, every balance in your bank. It's not wealth, it's an IOU, because the truth is this: money is debt, and the modern economy is a machine built to keep that debt alive forever. Let's start at the top, the Federal Reserve. When the Fed creates money, it's not printing piles of cash out of thin air. It's issuing credit. Here's how it works. The US government spends more than it earns, always. To cover the gap, it issues bonds. Those bonds are simply promises to pay in the future, with interest. The Fed steps in and buys those bonds. But what does the Fed use to pay for them? Money it just created. So new money enters the system, backed not by gold, not by production, but by debt. In other words, the US borrows to create money, and that borrowed money pays off old debt. Printing doesn't erase debt, it replaces it. That's why the system never ends. It rolls forward like a treadmill that can stop without collapsing. Every dollar you see is born from that process. Every new dollar is someone's new obligation. This is why I say, debt, not dollars, runs the modern economy. Let's make this real. Imagine you have a credit card. You max it out. Instead of paying it off, you open a new card and transfer the balance. That's how the government operates. At scale, it issues new debt to cover old debt. It calls it refinancing, deficit spending, quantitative easing. But it's all the same motion, kicking the can down the road, except there's no road left. Just more borrowing, more printing, and more promises to pay later. You can't run an empire on IOUs forever. Eventually, the bill comes due. Now here's where the illusion deepens. You're told that money equals wealth. But in this system, money equals liability. When banks lend you money, they don't give you their savings. They create new money by typing numbers into your account, backed by your promise to repay. That's the secret of fractional reserve banking. Every loan creates new money. Every repayment destroys it. So when you take on debt, the system expands. When you pay it off, the system contracts. The Fed's mission: keep that expansion going at all costs. Because if too much debt disappears, the system collapses. Growth stops. Liquidity dries up. Confidence evaporates. So they do the only thing they can. They keep printing, keep borrowing, and keep inflating. That's why the national debt never shrinks. It can't. The entire financial engine depends on more debt tomorrow than today. That's the treadmill, and it never stops. Here's the part most people miss. When you understand debt, you understand power. Because whoever issues the debt controls the system, and whoever owns the debt controls the issuer. Let me explain. When the government issues bonds, investors, foreign nations, banks, pension funds, buy them. That gives them leverage. China holds over $1 trillion in US bonds. Japan, another $1 trillion. That's not just an investment, that's influence. The US gets to spend today, but it owes tomorrow. And those IOUs define the future. That's why understanding bonds is essential if you want to understand the economy. Bonds are how nations borrow their way to growth. They're the foundation of the entire global system. Stocks may get the headlines, but bonds hold the power. They set interest rates. They price risk. They define how expensive money will be for every borrower, from governments to consumers. When bond yields rise, the cost of debt rises. When yields fall, money floods the system. That's why every investor, entrepreneur, and wealth builder must watch the bond market, not the news, because bonds are the pulse of the economy. Now here's where this matters to you. You live in a debt-based world. You can't change that, but you can choose your position within it. Here's how to play the game like the wealthy do. 1. Use debt productively, not passively. Bad debt buys things that lose value. Good debt buys assets that produce income. The rich borrow to buy cash flow. The poor borrow to buy consumption. Remember this rule. If debt makes you money, it's leverage. If it costs you money, it's slavery. 2. Understand interest rate cycles. When rates are low, smart money borrows. When rates rise, smart money owns cash-flowing assets that outpace inflation. You can't fight the cycle, but you can ride it. 3. Don't be the saver. Be the investor. In a debt-driven economy, savers lose. Their money is diluted by printing. Investors win because they own what debt inflates: assets. 4. Study the bond market. It's not optional, it's essential. The bond market tells you where capital is moving, what the Fed will do next, and how liquidity will flow. When yields spike, liquidity tightens. When yields drop, liquidity expands. That's how the pros time the markets, not emotion, but understanding. 5. Protect yourself from currency decay. If every dollar is debt, then every dollar's value depends on trust. That trust fades slowly, then suddenly. Hold assets that can't be printed: real estate, gold, productive businesses, intellectual property. Because the system won't save you, ownership will. Now let's zoom out again. The entire financial order is built on borrowed time, literally. Every government bond is a promise to pay with future productivity that hasn't happened yet. Every dollar printed today steals purchasing power from tomorrow. That's not growth. That's cannibalism disguised as policy. The system calls it expansion. But expansion through debt isn't progress. It's dependence. The more a nation borrows, the less freedom it has. The more individuals depend on credit, the less control they hold. And that's the great trap of the modern economy. People think they're getting richer, but they're just getting deeper into the system's chains. Because every new loan, every new bond, every new stimulus, it all feeds the same machine. A machine that can't afford to stop. So here's the mindset shift. Stop thinking in dollars. Start thinking in debt dynamics. Ask yourself, who owes who issues, who buys, who controls. Because wealth isn't about money. It's about position. If you're holding liabilities, you're being used. If you're holding assets, you're in control. And that's the secret the elite have always understood. They don't work for money. They work for leverage. They use the system's addiction to debt to build their own independence. Because while the government pays old debt with new, the wealthy pay old money with new cash flow. And that's the difference between the trapped and the free. Remember this: the Fed doesn't create wealth. It creates credit. The government doesn't fund growth. It funds debt. And every dollar that enters circulation is a silent promise, one that someone, somewhere, must eventually pay. But you don't have to be the one who pays it. You can be the one who profits from it, by understanding the game, by mastering leverage, by owning what others borrow to buy. Because in the modern economy, debt is the engine, but ownership is the driver. You don't need more money. You need better moves. You've now seen behind the curtain how the system runs not on cash, but on credit. How nations borrow, print, and promise their way forward. Now it's time to learn how to escape the trap entirely. Chapter 7. The Confidence Game. Why trust is the real currency. Money isn't metal. It isn't paper. It isn't even digital code. Money is trust. Every dollar, every euro, every yen is a promise wrapped in belief, a promise that tomorrow someone else will still accept it. That's the real foundation of modern finance, not gold, not silver, not oil. Belief. And when belief breaks, everything else breaks with it. We've been taught that money has value because governments say so, because central banks issue it, because it's legal tender. But the truth is simpler and far more fragile. Money only works because people believe it does. That's it. You hand someone a $20 bill and they trade you food, clothes, or service, not because of the ink on the paper, but because of the trust behind it. They trust the system, they trust the government, they trust that everyone else trusts it too. That's the confidence game. And it runs deeper than most people ever realize. Every major financial collapse in history wasn't just about numbers or markets. It was about belief dying. 1929. The Great Depression. Stocks crashed, yes. Banks failed, yes. But underneath it all, confidence evaporated. People stopped believing the system would recover. They stopped trusting banks to hold their money. They pulled their cash out. They hoarded gold. They froze the flow of commerce. And when trust stopped moving, money stopped moving. Money isn't backed by gold anymore. It's backed by belief. When belief dies, money dies. Fast forward to 2008. Another crisis of confidence. The banks didn't just hold bad loans, they held broken promises. They had packaged trust into financial products so complex that even they didn't understand what they were selling. When the world realized those promises were empty, belief collapsed. Credit froze. Markets panicked. Trillions evaporated overnight. Again, not because the assets disappeared, but because trust did. People weren't sure who owed what, who could pay, who to believe. And when belief goes missing, liquidity follows. Confidence is the oxygen of the financial system. When it's gone, everything suffocates. Here's the hard truth. Our entire monetary system is a psychological illusion sustained by faith. Central banks print, not gold, but confidence. Every stimulus check, every bailout, every quantitative easing round is a message. Don't panic. Keep believing. The system is still working. It's not economics, it's psychology. Because the second the masses lose faith in the dollar, the system collapses. That's why they'll do anything to protect confidence. Lower rates, raise rates, inject liquidity, spin the narrative. Because when trust dies, money dies. Let's break that down practically. When you put your money in a bank, you're not holding cash. You're holding a promise that you can withdraw it anytime. But if everyone withdraws at once, the system collapses. Why? Because the bank never had the money, only the belief that you wouldn't at all ask for it at the same time. Same thing with currencies. If tomorrow morning everyone decided the dollar wasn't worth anything, it wouldn't be. That's not theory. That's history. Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Weimar Germany, trillions printed, zero value, because when belief died, so did the currency. So what does this mean for you, the investor, the wealth builder, the one trying to get ahead? It means you can't just play the money game. You have to play the trust game. You have to ask, where is confidence rising and where is it fading? Because money flows toward trust. When people believe in something, they invest in it. When they stop believing, they run. That's why you must own real things, not just numbers on a screen. Own assets that don't vanish when confidence does. Land, businesses, cash-flowing systems. Because when paper burns, ownership survives. Wealth isn't earned, it's built. And it's built on a foundation stronger than faith in fiat. The system won't save you, ownership will. Now let's talk psychology. When markets crash, most people panic because they think money is safety. It's not. Money is a mirror of trust, and trust shifts fast. Smart investors don't chase safety, they chase stability. They hold what people will still value when belief wavers. That's why the wealthy diversify, not just across assets, but across systems. They hold currencies, commodities, companies, and land. They spread their belief, so no single collapse can destroy it. You don't need more money, you need better moves. Understand where confidence lives, move your capital toward it, and when the herd panics, stay calm, because you built wealth on something real. Every generation learns this lesson the hard way. When trust breaks, money reveals what it truly is. A story we all agreed to believe. The goal isn't to abandon the story. It's to understand it. Because when you understand how belief drives value, You stop reacting to headlines and start anticipating shifts. That's the real edge. That's how wealth builders think. They don't worship money. They study confidence. They invest in what people will trust next. Remember this: money isn't backed by gold anymore. It's backed by belief, and that belief can vanish overnight. So build your wealth on ownership, not illusion, on assets, not promises, on trust you control, not trust you rent. Because in the end, the confidence game rewards those who understand it and destroys those who don't. You've learned how fragile money really is. Now it is time to learn how to build power that doesn't depend on anyone else's promises. Chapter 8. The Myth of Free Money. They called it stimulus, they called it relief, they called it quantitative easing. But let's be clear, there's no such thing as free money. Never has been, never will be. Every dollar the government gives you is borrowed, either from your future taxes or your purchasing power today. You don't get free money, you get delayed pain. Here's the truth they don't teach in school. When a nation prints money to solve problems, it isn't fixing the problem. It's shifting it. Printing money doesn't create wealth, it just redistributes it. From savers to spenders, from workers to asset holders, from the disciplined to the desperate, because inflation is the silent tax that punishes responsibility. When governments inject trillions into the economy, that money doesn't magically create productivity. It creates distortion. Think back to the last time stimulus checks hit the world. The money flowed fast, stocks surged, housing prices exploded, crypto rocketed to the moon. Everyone felt richer, but it wasn't real wealth, it was inflated confidence. That's how the system works. Easy money fuels asset bubbles. Housing, stocks, crypto all rise not because of intrinsic value, but because liquidity floods the market. Too many dollars chase too few assets. It feels like prosperity until it isn't. Then reality hits. Prices crash. Confidence evaporates, and the illusion burns away. That's not a glitch, that's the cycle. Let's call it what it is. Stimulus isn't generosity, it's manipulation. It's the government saying, we can't fix the fundamentals, so we'll make you feel richer instead. That's the confidence game at scale. When people spend more, the economy appears stronger. When asset prices rise, people feel wealthier. But it's borrowed emotion, it's borrowed demand, and borrowed demand always comes due. When you stimulate without productivity, you create bubbles without foundations, and every bubble bursts. We saw it in 2000, the dot-com crash. We saw it in 2008, the housing collapse. We saw it again in 2022, when the everything bubble deflated. The pattern never changes, because easy money doesn't make markets smarter, it makes them greedier. Investors stop analyzing value and start chasing hype. People stop building and start speculating. Governments stop reforming and start printing. It's financial escapism, the illusion of growth without the discipline of production. And like all illusions, it demands a price. Here's what most people don't see. When the government spends what it doesn't have, someone eventually pays. That someone is you, not just through taxes, but through purchasing power. The loaf of bread that used to cost $2 now costs $4. Your savings buy less. Your rent rises. Your investments swing like a pendulum. The middle class suffers the most because they live in the zone between asset owners and wage earners. The wealthy own the assets that inflate. The poor often have nothing to lose, but the middle class? They get squeezed by the illusion of free money. You must understand this. There is always a trade-off. Every dollar printed is a dollar diluted. Every stimulus check is a promise of future inflation. Every rescue package is a reshuffling of responsibility. That's how fiat works. Printing isn't creation, it's borrowing. And the borrower is the system itself, betting that future productivity, future taxpayers, and future belief will cover today's excess. It's a financial treadmill with no finish line, so how do you protect yourself in a world addicted to easy money? First, stop thinking like a consumer. Start thinking like an owner. Consumers spend stimulus. Owners position before stimulus. When money printing begins, asset prices rise. When the printing stops, bubbles burst. If you want to build wealth, you must understand timing, not of markets, but of behavior. Ask yourself, what happens after the euphoria? Where does value flow when the liquidity dries up? That's where you position your capital. Wealth isn't earned, it's built. And it's built by anticipating what happens when free money stops feeling free. Second, anchor yourself to cash flow, not speculation. When the system injects money, speculators gamble on appreciation. Builders, investors, and business owners focus on income, because income survives what bubbles don't. Cash flow is freedom. When markets collapse, cash-flowing assets, rentals, dividends, royalties, businesses keep feeding you while others scramble. That's not luck. That's structure. You don't need more money. You need better moves. Own systems that generate real value. Own skills that can't be inflated away. Own assets that pay you to hold them. That's how you win the game. Not by chasing free money, but by controlling real money flow. And third, adopt the discipline the system lacks. Governments overspend, corporations over-leverage, consumers over-borrow. But the wealth builders do the opposite. They preserve liquidity. They manage debt like a tool, not a drug. They move slowly when everyone else is rushing. Because in times of easy money, discipline becomes your greatest asset. While others get trapped in inflated lifestyles, you're quietly building infrastructure. Cash, income streams, hard assets, and independence. When the tide goes out, you don't drown, you buy. Remember this line, if it feels free, it's probably borrowed from your future. That's true for stimulus, true for credit, true for every decision that trades short-term comfort for long-term cost. Free money is the bait. Debt is the hook, inflation is the catch, and the only way to escape it is to stop playing the game on their terms, because the system won't save you, ownership will. Build cash flow, build control, build confidence in your own production, not their printing. That's how wealth endures, not through illusion, but through discipline. You've now seen how free money destroys the very freedom it promises. Now it is time to explore the other side of the illusion. How nations use debt itself as the fuel for control. Chapter 9. How the wealthy beat inflation. Inflation doesn't scare the wealthy, it trains them. Because the rich know something the average person doesn't. Inflation is not a surprise, it's a strategy. When governments print, when costs rise, when the dollar weakens, the rich don't panic. They position. Because inflation punishes cash, but rewards ownership. And the rule is simple. Cash is trash in inflation. Assets are armor. Let's start with the mindset shift, because this is where most people lose. When prices go up, the average person tightens their belt. They focus on cutting costs, but the wealthy focus on increasing control. The poor save in dollars, the rich save in assets. You see, inflation doesn't destroy value. It transfers it from those who hold cash to those who hold things that produce income, things that appreciate over time, things that the system can't print. That's how the wealthy beat inflation, not by earning more, but by owning smarter. Let's break it down. 1. Real assets, the hard shields. When inflation rises, money loses power because it's soft. It can be printed, diluted, and destroyed by policy. But real assets, property, commodities, productive businesses, are hard. They have intrinsic utility. They're limited in supply. You can't print more real estate. You can't digitally duplicate farmland. You can't legislate away gold scarcity. That's why the rich buy tangible assets when others hoard cash. They understand this equation. Dollars die, assets endure. In inflationary times, property prices rise, not because homes are more valuable, but because money is worth less. The asset didn't get richer. The currency got weaker. So when your neighbor complains that groceries are up 20%, the investor is quietly celebrating that his real estate just followed. That's not luck, that's positioning. 2. Equities, the ownership game. The middle class earns wages. The wealthy earn profits. Wages lag inflation. Profits can outrun it. That's why owning businesses, directly or through stocks, is key. Think of it like this. If inflation drives up prices, companies raise prices too. The cost of goods rises, but so do corporate revenues. And when revenues rise, equity holders, owners benefit. That's why the wealthy don't store value in cash. They store it in companies. Every time the currency weakens, assets that produce cash flow become more valuable relative to the dollar. Inflation doesn't hurt them, it helps them. 3. Commodities, the reality hedge. When the financial world becomes uncertain, the physical world reasserts value. Oil, metals, grain, these are real. You can touch them, trade them, and transport them. Commodities respond to scarcity, not speeches. They move on demand, not politics. And during inflationary cycles, commodities often lead. That's why sophisticated investors use commodity exposure, directly or through ETFs, as part of their inflation armor. Because when paper money melts, matter still matters. But here's the deeper layer most people miss. The wealthy don't just own assets, they leverage inflation itself. They use debt strategically, because in inflationary environments, debt becomes cheaper in real terms. Let's say you borrow $1 million to buy a property. If inflation rises 10%, that million you owe is now worth 10% less in purchasing power. You repay with weaker dollars. Inflation erodes your debt, not your wealth. That's why the wealthy use fixed-rate debt as a weapon. They borrow while money is cheap and invest in assets that rise as money weakens. You can't outwork inflation, but you can out-own it. Now, let's talk psychology, because beating inflation isn't just financial, it's mental. Most people react emotionally to rising prices. They feel squeezed, threatened, angry, but emotion is the tax on inaction. The wealthy stay rational. They understand that inflation is policy by design. It's how governments manage debt and maintain control. So instead of resisting inflation, they reposition around it. They diversify across asset classes, currencies, and countries. They keep liquid reserves to seize opportunities when markets panic. And they train their minds to see every crisis as a cycle, not an ending, but a window. That mindset is priceless, because inflation doesn't end wealth, ignorance does. Let's put this into strategy. Here's how to think and act like inflation's opponent, not its victim. 1. Stop hoarding cash. Keep enough for liquidity, but not for wealth storage. Inflation will quietly steal it. 2. Own productive assets. Real estate that generates rent, stocks that pay dividends, businesses that solve real problems. Cash flow is freedom. 3. Hedge with reality. Hold commodities or inflation-linked assets as insurance. Don't speculate, diversify. 4. Leverage responsibly. Use fixed-rate debt to buy appreciating assets, not depreciating toys. In inflation, debt is a tool, not a trap. 5. Stay informed and nimble. Inflation cycles change. What works this decade may not next. Adjust faster than the average investor. The wealthy beat inflation because they move before inflation moves them. Understand this. Inflation is not your enemy if you know the game. It's a signal, a warning that the currency is weakening and ownership is the only defense. So when you hear headlines screaming about rising prices, don't freeze. Focus Ask yourself one question. How can I own the things that inflation rewards? Because that's the key. Inflation punishes those who hold promises. It rewards those who hold property. Wealth isn't earned, it's built. And in inflationary times, it's built by owning what others rent. The system won't save you. It can't. But ownership will. When governments inflate, you elevate through assets, through leverage, through clarity. Because the truth is simple. Cash is trash in inflation. Assets are armor. You've now learned how the wealthy defend against inflation. But the next level is offense. How they use inflation to expand power and buy distressed assets when everyone else is drowning. That's where the real money is made. Chapter 10. The real way to create wealth. Everyone talks about wealth. Few understand where it actually comes from. Here's the truth. Governments can print money. Banks can expand credit. But only you can create wealth. Because wealth isn't printed. It's produced. True wealth is built through production, innovation, and ownership. Not inflation, not speculation, not manipulation. That's the secret the system hides in plain sight. When a government stimulates the economy by printing, it's not creating value. It's redistributing it. When you work, build, invent, or invest in something real, that's creation. You make something new exist in the world. You solve a problem. You generate productivity. That's real wealth. Everything else is noise. Printing money doesn't grow the economy. It just stretches the same pie thinner. Real wealth makes the pie bigger. Let's break it down simply. There are only two ways money moves, through creation or through circulation. The poor circulate money. They earn it, spend it, and start again. The middle class saves it, often losing to inflation in the process. But the wealthy create it. How? By building systems that produce more value than they consume. That's the law of true wealth. You can print currency, but you can't print productivity. You can fake growth, but you can't fake creation. Real wealth is built when you turn ideas, skills, or capital into assets that work without you. Let's make this practical. If you're working a job, you're trading time for money. That's fine, but it's not scalable. There are only 24 hours in a day. But when you build something, a business, a product, a platform, a property, you detach your income from your hours. That's when compounding starts. Wealth isn't earned, it's built. And it's built by replacing labor with leverage. Leverage through assets, leverage through automation, leverage through ownership. The system won't save you. Ownership will. Governments can fake growth through spending. They can inflate the economy through debt. But individuals can't fake productivity. You can't print skill. You can't counterfeit discipline. You can't fabricate value. That's why the wealthiest people in history, from Rockefeller to Musk, didn't just hold money. They built machines that made it. They built systems that produced more than they consumed. That's the formula. Always has been. Create more value than you consume. That's real money printing. You don't have to be a billionaire to apply that principle. You just need to think like a builder, not a consumer. When most people get money, they ask, "What can I buy?" Builders ask, "What can I build that keeps paying me?" That mindset shift changes everything. You stop seeing money as something to spend. You start seeing it as something to deploy. Every dollar you control can either serve your lifestyle or your legacy. If you spend it, it's gone. If you invest it, it multiplies. Wealth builders understand this deeply. Cash flow is freedom, not status, not salary. Cash flow. Because cash flow means your assets are producing value while you sleep. That's the closest thing to printing your own money, legally, ethically, and sustainably. Now, let's get even more practical. Here are the 3 ways real wealth is created. 1. Production. Make something. It could be a product, content, a service, or a system. Every creator adds to the economic engine. Every producer moves the world forward. If you can build something that solves problems for others, you'll never need to chase money. Money will chase you. 2. Innovation. Don't just copy what's been done, improve it. Innovation multiplies value. When Apple improved the phone, it didn't just sell devices, it changed behavior. When entrepreneurs innovate, they redefine markets. Innovation is leveraged creativity. It's how small thinkers become big players. 3. Ownership. This is the multiplier. You can produce and innovate for someone else and still be broke, but ownership changes the game. When you own the equity, you own the outcome. When you own the system, you control the income. That's why the wealthy obsess over ownership. Not jobs, not titles, not applause. The system rewards owners, not participants. Now let's talk about why. Most people never reach this stage. They confuse activity with productivity. They stay busy, but not effective. They consume knowledge, but don't apply it. And worst of all, they wait for the system to change. But the system won't change. You have to change how you use it. Stop playing the game as a consumer. Start playing it as a creator. Because the government can fake GDP, corporations can fake earnings, but you can't fake the value you produce in the real world. If you can make something people need, if you can create something people want, you will always have leverage. Let's be blunt. Real wealth isn't built in the stock market. It's built before the stock market. It's built by the innovators, the investors, and the builders who understand how value flows. They know that every dollar in circulation originated from someone's productivity, someone's creation. So when you build, you're tapping into the true source of wealth. Not the illusion of printed paper, but the engine of human potential. That's the wealth nobody can inflate or confiscate, because it's rooted in creation. So how do you start building real wealth today? 1. Create something small but scalable. A product, a skill, a digital asset, a rental, something that can grow without trading more of your time. 2. Reinforce ownership. If you don't own it, you can't control it. If you can't control it, you can't scale it. 3. Reinvent yourself as a producer, not a passenger. You are your most powerful asset. Develop your ability to produce, not just perform, because performance gets paid once. Production gets paid forever. Every great wealth builder lives by one principle: create more than you consume. That's it. That's how individuals outgrow inflation. That's how families build generational wealth. That's how societies recover from economic collapse. Because production is power, and ownership is freedom. Governments can fake growth. Individuals can't. They can print money. You can print value. The system runs on confidence, but your wealth must run on creation. Because at the end of the day, the real way to create wealth is timeless. Produce more, own more, consume less. That's the wealth equation that never breaks. You've now learned how true wealth is created through productivity, innovation, and ownership. Printing money looks like a solution, but it's a trap. Every shortcut in finance is a slow disaster in disguise. You can flood the world with paper, but you can't fake productivity. The truth is simple. The more money governments print, the harder individuals must work to stay ahead of inflation. So stop waiting for policy to save you. Outsmart it. Buy assets. Build value. Earn income that rises faster than prices. Because in a world that keeps printing, savers lose and creators win. Start today. Build something real, because the printer never sleeps, and neither should your ambition.